Chapter 11. Don't play your cards too soon. The telegram arrived mere minutes before our entourage set off for Alpac, and I couldn't resist immediately lifting the sheet of paper to my nose in search of my mate's signature aroma, because the message had to be from Wolfie, even though there was no odor of shifter about it, and even though the human delivery guy professed to have no knowledge of who the anonymous sender might have been. I grinned to think of my tech-savvy partner working the system to bypass both the chief's restrictions and his brother's nosy interest, all the while managing to get his words in front of my greedy eyes, exactly when I needed him to contact me the most. Just 3 hours until I see the handsome shifter himself. That thought was enough to put a faint replica of the chief's bite into my voice as I hurried along the shifters who were currently loading our camping equipment into the convoy of cars. The sooner we left Haven, the sooner we'd reach Justin's territory, and the sooner I could enjoy a long-awaited reunion with my mate. Unfortunately, that reunion would have to be put off just a little longer, because I realized that a fist fight was poised to break out between the young shifters under my care. 7 of us would be traveling from Haven this morning, and the relatively small number of travelers should have made it easy to divide the participants up into 3 partially loaded cars. Or so I'd thought. Instead, both Blaze and David turned out to be adamantly opposed to our pack princess riding in the other's vehicle, and the male shifters' repeated attempts at halting the girl in question from taking a seat in either car meant that Sarah was now starting to sway from exhaustion. Worse, the contestants' voices were growing more heated with every exchange, and I could tell that my opportunity to intervene had nearly passed. "Are you sure you're even old enough to drive?" David was asking the youngest Yahoo. When I finally pulled my nose out of Wolfie's telegram, my relative's taunt was particularly maddening because of its lack of heat, and while I wouldn't have wanted to be a passenger in a car driven by Blaze either, my cousin wasn't being entirely fair when he made it sound as if the youngest Yahoo's voice hadn't yet broken. "Maybe Sarah doesn't want to ride with a wilder who'd like to regress to the days before women had the right to vote," Blaze rebutted. I rolled my eyes, thinking that the Yahoo's words would have carried more weight if David wasn't one of my more open-minded relatives. But I still saw my cousin clench his jaw in anger. The verbal blows were apparently finding their mark on both sides. "Hey, how come nobody's fighting over the opportunity to ride with me?" Fun spoke up, trying to interject a bit of humor into the occasion. But the males ignored her voice of reason and continued to glare at each other. Both shifters were obviously waiting for their opponent to back down, but the combatants seemed pretty evenly matched, which was a recipe for the verbal altercation turning into a physical fight. My leadership style was generally pretty hands-off, but the person most likely to defuse this drama, Sarah, seemed either unable or unwilling to elucidate which shifter she had her eye on. In fact, based on the girl's complete lack of eye contact at the moment, I couldn't be sure that she actually liked either of the males in the first place. Instead, our guest seemed content to allow the males to duke out ownership of her body while she sagged against the hood of my car, all effort going into standing upright. And while I was still considering the best way to get out of this altercation without slapping both young men down, Blaze took a step forward, his arm raised and his hand clenched into a fist, proving that I couldn't put off my own decision any longer. "Sarah will ride with me," I interjected quickly. Sarah, and scanning the waiting faces, I settled upon the female Yahoo as the odd woman out, and Foen. And so I lost the opportunity to bond with my new pack during the ride to all pack. But at least the schism between Yahoos and Wilders didn't grow any wider that afternoon, and no blood was shed on my watch. The Young's campground was a bit smaller than the field my father had always earmarked for all pack participants, and the ground was rougher, but the same heady mixture of excitement and danger filled the air. My party had arrived just after sunset, when bonfires were being lit around the dance floor while meat sizzled on spits, and the lack of light should have made it harder to find our potential allies. But even though the gathering had been transported to an entirely different state, every clan had still opted to set up camp in the exact same configuration as in years past. I could smell the small bell contingent nearly hidden beneath the trees and could make out Camilla's new clan right in the thick of the action. Scattered around those superpowers were several smaller packs, generally located closest to the clans that they allied with, most often the lesser alphas seeking protection from the stronger pack leaders in their midst. Finally, my eye picked out the host of the gathering, Justin Young, whose entourage was parked off to one side. It was traditional for the hosting alpha to camp alongside his guests, even though he and his honor guard would possess houses with real beds nearby, so I wasn't surprised to smell pine needles, leaf mold, and gunmetal as soon as I stepped out of my car. The only really unexpected part was that the Youngs hadn't plopped down right in the middle of the field, asserting their dominance over the other packs through pride of place. Perhaps that omission was a sign that Justin wasn't quite as confident in his coup as he wanted to appear? No matter how I analyzed Justin's camping location, though, the more relevant site was a 1,000-square-foot patch of empty ground waiting for the wilders. At the opposite end of the field from Justin's encampment, like satellites orbiting a planet, the griffins and reeds had plunked themselves down beside the spot that would belong to their strongest ally, and I felt a bit bad about leaving our affiliated clans in the lurch. But if I wanted to play this new hand of cards a few at a time as Wolfie had suggested, then I couldn't just slide into the niche that my father had left behind. Instead, I needed more allies beyond these two small clans who were always quick to follow where the wilders led. And the obvious way to showcase my hypothetical strong backers was through proximity. So, instead of setting up camp in our traditionally designated spot, I abandoned my companions by our cars and strode alone through the thick of the action to the edge of Justin's campfire. With so many alphas concentrated in such a small space, all pack managed to prevent bloodshed by dint of ceding each patch of earth to the clan in question as their temporary but unilateral territory, so I had to zig and zag to avoid trespassing on Grey Price and Cooper land as I approached my destination. But once I'd arrived, I didn't wait to be acknowledged and instead walked right into the glow surrounding the campfire. "Justin Young," I called, wishing that my voice was deeper as half a dozen heads turned in my direction, and as the odor of raised hackles filled the air, the signature aromas of Justin's honor guard all smelled faintly like Wolfie's, but the similarity wasn't enough to prevent my stomach from clenching up in anticipation of the battle of wills to come. I was gambling on the hope that Justin still thought I was simply a weak pack princess, and that the alpha had simply seized hosting rights because he'd noticed a power vacuum instead of because he'd seen through my charade a few weeks previously. In this best-case scenario, Wolfie's brother would welcome me as a potential mate whose relatives could further shore up his own power, my partnership bringing with it the weight of the entire Wilder clan when the time came to face down Justin's opponents. On the other hand, if the young leader had gone behind my back to seize control of all pack after realizing that I was trifling with his affections, well, in that case I was an opposing alpha who had just walked uninvited onto another pack leader's territory, and he and his henchmen would have no compunction about tearing me apart. So I stood alone in the firelight and waited for Justin to respond to my greeting, wishing all the while that I'd paid more attention to Sarah's fashion advice during our recent car ride. At the time, I'd been stressing about losing sight of Wade's and Hawk's cars during each of my pregnant passengers' frequent bathroom breaks, so the girls' chatterings about clothes and makeup had drifted over me like a passing cloud. But as Justin's eyes trailed down my form, searing a path of physical awareness in its wake, I realized that a true pack princess would have gussied herself up before running to the side of her potential mate. Wolfie had told me that my lupin half was beautiful, and I loved the way my true mate's eyes lit up when they passed over my curves in both human and wolf form, and yet I'd never felt particularly attractive in anyone else's view, and I knew that my ragged jeans and wrinkled t-shirt weren't what Justin was used to seeing from a pack princess. My traitorous cheeks blushed in embarrassment at the thought, and perhaps that was the signal that Justin had been waiting for, a hint that I was girlishly taken with the alpha in front of me, even if that's not actually why my cheeks had turned red. But I couldn't argue with the results. A smile that reminded me of my father's malicious grins now stretched across a face that reminded me of my mates, and Justin rose and walked toward me with arms extended in greeting. Taking my hand and raising it to his lips, the alpha purred out his next words. "The beautiful Tara Wilder," he greeted me. "Shall I help you set up camp?" "It's not the how I need help with so much as the where," I replied, steeling myself not to jerk my hand away from Justin's firm grip. And then suddenly, the alpha in front of me faded from my awareness as I felt Wolfie's eyes lock onto my back. Instantly, my previously grumpy wolf woke up and began to dance beneath my skin. Enough games, she demanded. It's time to greet our mate. But I couldn't simply turn around and approach Wolfie. Instead, I had to smile at his brother and attempt to make nice as I pouted over the Wilder's designated campsite. I thought I'd get to camp here beside you, I continued, trying to figure out what Sarah would have done to wrap Wolfie's scary brother around her finger. In fact, now that I thought about it, how had the girl managed to produce not one but two shifters willing to fawn over her within a week of her arrival? How had she attracted their regard even as her belly grew to roughly the size of a small boat? If Sarah's success was any indication, then attractiveness couldn't be based on looks alone, giving me hope that I'd yet be able to tempt Justin into letting me park my tents next to his. I just assumed. Justin began, then paused. Tradition, he continued, shaking his head as if to clear it. And perhaps the little bit of advice I'd gleaned from Sarah was working after all if this terrifying alpha was tongue-tied in my presence. I peered up from beneath my lashes, even though my wolf put her paws over her face in disgust at the action, and I hoped that my efforts had indeed been a success. Chet, Luke, tell the Grays and Coopers to scoot over and make room for Miss Tara here, Justin said, finally regaining his ability to speak in time to bark orders at his underlings. The Wilders will be camping beside us. When I'd suitably thanked my supposed beau and turned away from the light of the fire, I was finally able to fall into Wolfie's eyes. Our Lupin halves spoke without the need for words. Possessiveness, love, and joy all shimmering through the darkness between us in the split second it took for our gazes to meet. And then my feet were taking me toward my lover's arms before my rational brain could slow us down or turn our body in another direction. Wolf ears. Wade was suddenly by my side, clearly having dogged my footsteps through the ranks of foreign shifters, and the oldest Yahoo took my arm now, before I could ruin the entire charade that I'd taken so much effort to set up. As much as I hated to admit it, the shifter's warning was apropos. With werewolves surrounding us on every side, Wolfie and I really couldn't risk sharing a single word, since even whispers could be easily heard from nearby campsites. In fact, the extended glance that we'd already shared was probably being torn apart and analyzed by the other werewolves at this very moment. That thought was like a bucket of cold water splashed over my head, and I was finally able to breathe, if not yet to look away from my mate. At least my attention was able to shift beyond his eyes, though, giving me the opportunity to notice that the unconventional alpha hadn't set up a territory for his contingent at all. Instead, he appeared to have chosen to attend all pack entirely alone. Trust Wolfie to be so confident in his own superiority that he wasn't afraid of being set upon by however many shifters the other alphas might point in his direction. My mate probably figured that he'd be able to whip 100 wolves into shape just as easily as 20, and so far no one seemed to doubt his abilities. Wouldn't it be nice if I could also eschew all pack power plays and do the same? But of course I couldn't. Not with half of the local clans already turned against me due to my father's past actions, and with the other half quite willing to vanquish a seemingly weak female alpha for the sake of taking over her pack. Instead, I allowed Wade to turn me back around so I could make apologies to the less powerful clans that Justin had displaced in order to do my bidding. And before long, I was so caught up in determining who should share Sarah's tent, that would be me, that both young brothers faded from the forefront of my mind. But I couldn't force the aftereffects of either of their gazes to fade from deep within my belly, because my mate's eyes had been so full of wolf that I was almost afraid of the passion I saw therein, and Justin's gaze had been so coldly assessing that I couldn't quite convince myself that the latter had truly fallen prey to my non-existent wiles. Chapter 12. Somehow, in the midst of dismantling Cooper and Gray tents and setting up Wilder tents in their place, no one noticed what Wolfie was doing until it was too late. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At the time, I was still coming down off the adrenaline high of facing off against Wolfie's brother in plain view of several other alphas, and the drama that subsequently cropped up within my own ranks kept me too busy after that to spare more than a passing glance for my mate. So after Wolfie faded away into the crowd that afternoon, my Lupin half fell back asleep and my attention focused on keeping my immediate pack in line. Setting up camp should have been easy, but as with everything else at all pack, there were subtleties within subtleties to consider. our new encampment, butted up against Justin's, but I chose to locate my tent at the far side of our allotted space since I wasn't able to stomach the idea of sleeping a stone's throw away from Wolfie's older brother. And as I was erecting my canvas dwelling, I also had to keep half an eye on my companions who seemed bound and determined to showcase my total lack of pack leader abilities in front of the neighbors. First came the drama over sleeping arrangements. Even though I would have preferred to enjoy a bit of solitude within my own tent, I'd instead chosen to share with Sarah in an attempt to keep bickering at bay. But David and Blaze proved that my effort at proactivity had been worthless when they struck up an argument over whose tent would be erected closest to the alphas. The attraction clearly not being myself since I was growing grumpier with my honor guard by the moment. After that issue was settled, by parking each wilder tent at a far corner of our territory rather than clustering them all together as I'd originally intended, it was time to delineate the boundaries of our new land, which turned into another quite literal pissing contest. You know, most of us are bright enough to change into wolf form before marking territorial boundaries. Fun chastised, looking up from her job of lighting the campfire in time to catch Blaze chugging a liter of water in hopes of upping his urine production. Sarah's two potential beaux seemed to have decided that whoever could mark the longest stretch of border around our all-pack territory was the most dominant male, which I guess made a strange sort of sense if you were a 18-year-old guy who measured your inherent worth by the output of your penis. Bigger bladder when two-legged, Blaze replied shortly before rushing off to continue pouring out his seemingly never-ending stream of urine across the grass. As her friend left, Fawn and I exchanged a commiserating glance, and I could tell that we were both equally exasperated by the youngest Yahoo's childish behavior. But, on the plus side, the contest between Blaze and David did keep the two contestants out of my hair for a few minutes while also eliminating my own need to assist in marking the boundaries of our property. So it was only after I'd finally settled the Yahoos and my two relatives down for the night and headed back toward my tent to check on my pregnant charge that I noticed Wolfie's truck parked a mere hand's breadth away from where I would lay my head that night. Seemed that, while I wasn't looking, Wolfie had chosen his own territory, and apparently I was it. But the bloodling alpha hadn't stopped there. Despite the lack of electric lights in the campground, enough fires were scattered across the field to allow me to make out the form of my mate, who was currently trotting footed around a vast half-moon shape larger than my and Justin's territories put together. And, just as the Yahoos had done earlier on my behalf, Wolfie was currently marking the boundaries of his temporary property with urine. Couldn't help thinking that, if the quantity of effluent really was proportional to the quality of the alpha, then my mate was definitely the most dominant werewolf around. Only when a shout arose from Justin's encampment did I realize that Wolfie wasn't just breaking with tradition by marking off such a large territory entirely on his own. The bloodling alpha had also sidestepped the unspoken all-pack rule of leaving unmarked out territory aisles to allow easy traffic between each alpha's peed-upon land. Every other clan present had carefully allotted 5 feet of empty space between their markers and those of their neighbors, but Wolfie had instead butted his land right up against parts of my and Justin's territorial boundaries, completely encircling wilder territory within a young moat. I couldn't afford to show any preference for my mate. After all, I was still trying to string along Justin and perhaps gain the attention of a few other alphas while I was at it, and my plans would be soundly derailed by a show of affection from my true mate. But, despite my better sense, I couldn't help smiling widely as I realized that Wolfie's strangely shaped territory would protect me from invaders on 3 of my territory's 4 sides. The realization that Wolfie's prodigious pee was being utilized in my defense warmed me in the same way that the telegram had, and I felt my wolf stir happily within my skin. But even as I smiled into the darkness, I also saw that I had underestimated my mate's protective instincts. The bloodling alpha wasn't content with simply enfolding the wilder pack within his territory on 3 sides. Instead, Wolfie was bound and determined to completely cut his mate off from the big bad world. "What do you think you're doing?" Justin's angry voice rolled across the campground, and I wasn't the only one that caught Wolfie walking right up to his brother's boundary line, then raising a leg to pee. Like good shifters, Blaze and David had provided an out-territory aisle between our territory and that of the older Young's clan. And now Wolfie was taking advantage of that no man's land to sprinkle urine directly on top of his brother's marker. In essence, my mate was killing two birds with one stone all at once. He taunted his brother and also completed my protective circle, blocking off Justin's access to the wilder camp along our shared boundary. The bloodling alpha had nearly completed his line of urine by the time his brother started toward him at a run, and I could almost feel Wolfie's amusement when, despite his haste, Justin paused before jumping over the double young territorial marker. The older alpha's vacillation was unconscious admission that Justin was afraid to cross his little brother's line, and I knew that every nearby werewolf would be marking that omission down in their mental tally book, ceding the first point to my mate. Meanwhile, when Justin continued down the territorial line to cross over in a spot where only his own pack's urine had soaked into the ground, the achievement of his destination didn't make up for the face that Justin had lost in the process. But my mate's brother was well aware of the impression he was making, and he quickly strove to regain the lead with both tone and posture. "That's far enough," Justin said at last, standing firm and tall above his brothers. Lupin form. The older alpha might have been afraid to cross his brother's line, but he had clearly dredged up enough courage to attempt to prevent Wolfie from completely cutting the elder Young's pack off from potential contact with my territory, and Wolfie's refusal to take human form did act a bit in Justin's favor, making my mate appear weaker in contrast. Behind the older alpha, I could see several of Justin's underlings rush forward to back up their alpha, while another dashed off in the other direction, presumably heading toward their main village in search of reinforcements. I was surprised that Justin didn't call after his lackeys to prevent the latter action, since that was another sure way to lose face for the host to be forced to expand his honor guard beyond what other pack leaders had been allotted in order to keep the peace was proof that he wasn't the strongest alpha present after all. Is the messenger acting without his alpha's permission? I wondered. Or is Justin so unsure of his success that he's willing to risk lowered status in an effort to protect his own skin? But as the rest of the audience and I mulled over Justin's actions, Wolfie ignored all of the commotion. Instead, my mate continued to slowly walk forward, lifting his leg at intervals to squirt urine directly on top of his brother's territorial line. And with each splash, Justin's face turned redder, and his jaw clenched tighter. I almost expected my mate to continue walking and peeing even after he reached his brother, simply dribbling urine right over the other alpha's foot as Wolfie continued his unhurried effort to completely enclose the wilder pack within his own territory. And at that point, would Justin explode? Or implode? As much as I would have liked to wait and see what happened, though, I really couldn't allow either reaction. Not that Wolfie's behavior and his brother's chagrin didn't make my wolf dance in glee, and my human side relax just the barest smidgen upon realizing that my insufficient honor guard and I wouldn't be standing up to all of the other packs entirely alone. Yes, I'll admit that. The thought of being entirely enclosed within Wolfie's territory sounded like a day at the spa and a hunk of gooey chocolate cake all rolled into one. The only thing better would be if my mate similarly encircled me within his arms. But Wolfie himself had warned me not to play all of my cards at one time, and my mate bond with the younger alpha was definitely a trump card that was better kept hidden at this time. Plus, from a purely utilitarian perspective, if Wolfie completed his circle of P, then my pack and I would be forced to ask the other alpha for permission every time we entered or left our encampment, which could get tricky and annoying and would definitely make us look bad in front of the other clans. So I headed toward my mate at last, albeit more slowly than his brother had made his similar journey, and I was sure to kick the tent that Wade and Blaze shared on my way to the boundary line. "Wah!" Blaze's voice called out groggily, but the older Yahoo was up and by my side, if clad only in boxers, before I'd taken 2 more steps. By the time my guard and I reached the sibling standoff, a cluster of interested shifters from other packs had also made an appearance, ensuring that word of this event would reach all corners of the all-pack campground within the hour. But I ignored my audience just as Wolfie had and strode quickly down the out-territory aisle to stand between the other 2 pack leaders. Finally, without looking at either young alpha, I turned to Wade and pretended to berate the one member of my contingent who had yet to cause any problems at all. "You neglected to mark a path here," I said, putting the alpha command into my voice for the sake of the bystanders, even though Wade needed no impetus to follow my lead. I expect several visitors tomorrow, so our site should be accessible to all and sundry. Sorry about that, boss, Wade replied, his wolf crouching down within his human form and its ears submissively lowering at my tone of voice. But I had a feeling the Yahoo understood that we were just play acting as he continued. Where exactly do you want the path? If you guys don't mind, I said primly, finally meeting the eyes of each young alpha in turn and gracing both with the same half-smile. Justin was too surprised by my presence to do anything except back up into his own territory. But Wolfie just plopped down onto his lupin butt and allowed his tongue to loll out of the side of his mouth. Yes, Wolfie, I know you think this is great fun, I wanted to say. But I couldn't, of course, not with my mate's brother and the other shifters all avidly looking on. Instead, I just scrubbed away a bit of Wolfie's hard work, scraping up the urine-soaked grass with my shod heel in order to open up 5 feet of space in the contested area for the sake of wilder egress. I'd half expected Wolfie to protest, but I was soon proven wrong. Instead, my mate just grinned wider, glad to let me take him down a notch in front of the other alphas, and I realized as I worked that Wolfie had probably been able to guess my most likely reaction all along. My mate might even have planned for me to piggyback on his own success in this manner, figuring that if I was able to face down one of the strongest alphas at all pack, then I would gain face in front of the other clans. As a result, Wolfie's self-appointed job of preventing me from being torn to shreds became significantly easier. But that was probably giving the bloodling too much strategizing credit. Wolfie had never been one to back down from a fight, and his lupin grin now suggested that he was enjoying playing games with other alphas in general and with his brother in particular. And as much as the idea that Wolfie was taking this altercation so lightly exasperated me, I couldn't resist letting my eyes rest for a split second on my mates. Immediately my wolf started dancing beneath my skin, and she nearly yipped in glee at Wolfie's proximity. Start here, I told Wade, attempting to remain focused on the larger issue of wilder safety as I pointed out a line of bare earth leading from the boundary of our territory into the center of our campsite, and then bring the trail all the way up to our fire circle. Now my mate finally growled, unhappy with any action that would allow outsiders' entrance into the core of wilder territory, and by my side Wade's inner wolf cowered yet further, caught in the crossfire between the alpha he'd been obeying for the last few weeks and the stronger alpha who was his original and true leader. But our audience didn't need to know what was really going on. Instead, I wanted them to see crazy Wilder's daughter facing down the erratic but powerful Wolfie Young even after he'd complained at her choice of actions. So I stepped up to the snarling wolf, crouched down until the two of us could see eye to eye, and glared into my mate's furry face. Do you have a problem with what I do on my own property, Wolf Young? I demanded, doing my best to keep a straight face. And to my delight, Wolfie played along, without shifting back into human form. To exchange words with either me or his brother, the bloodling wolf got to his feet and padded away. And at last, with a shrug, Wade hastened to do my bidding. Chapter 14. Wolfie must have caught the same view of his brother's glare that I had. Or, at least I hoped that was why my mate redoubled his efforts to ignore me. No matter the reason, I didn't manage to catch Wolfie's eye for the rest of the afternoon, which is the only way I can explain succumbing to Sarah's efforts to dress me in the guise of a pack princess for the upcoming ball. Or maybe my lapse was caused by temporary insanity. The second explanation definitely does sound more likely. That's really what you plan to wear to the princess ball? My tent mate asked. That evening, the girl's usually quiet voice suddenly loud with shock. Unfortunately for me, the dusk beginning to filter into our tent hadn't been enough to hide my jeans and t-shirt, and even I had to admit that the combo wasn't appropriate garb for what amounted to a debutante coming out ball. But there hadn't been any spare gowns laying around back in Haven, and my usual fashion coach, Cricket, had been too engrossed with worrying about her husband to suggest sewing an outfit in preparation for all-pack. Still, the sparkly fabric that Sarah pulled out of her rather tremendous duffel bag made me back away in horror. That's nice of you, I began. But, oh please, Sarah replied, tossing aside the glittery white outfit and digging deeper. That one's for me. You'd swim in it with no bun in the oven. But this one, To my surprise, the little black dress that had been shoved into the bottom of Sarah's bag was actually acceptable, because even though the outfit would be more revealing than I was used to, at least the color would allow me to fade into the night if I was so inclined, my usual MO at these gatherings in the past having consisted of sneaking away as soon as was humanly possible to explore the nearby woods on my own. And while I wasn't thrilled at the idea of exposing so much cleavage, a clothing choice that somehow felt more titillating than being entirely naked, I did agree with my tentmate that I'd blend better in her dress than in my jeans. But why would Sarah have packed an outfit that she couldn't fit into in the first place? It's my security blanket, the pack princess replied to my unspoken question, watching me finger the scanty fabric with a bittersweet expression on her young face. Mom gave it to me on my 16th birthday. This was more personal information than Sarah had ever offered before, and I stayed silent in hopes she would elaborate. Finally, when the girl's sparse explanation seemed to be at an end, I looked up into her eyes, and for the first time since meeting Trouble, I thought I might be able to discern the real personality lying beneath her skin. My uninvited guest wasn't just a pack princess, wrapping guys around her little finger in order to get her way. Sarah was a pregnant teenager, soon to be a single mother, and she was scared. I wouldn't want to risk spilling something on a dress you care so much about, I started, but Sarah just rolled her eyes at me and shook her head sternly while continuing to hold out the dress. So I accepted the ball of fabric out of her hands and tried another conversational tack. Did you ever consider going back home to your parents after you left Justin? I asked. I couldn't, the girl replied shortly, then looked away. The simplicity of her response made me want to fold the girl into my arms, but like my stepmother, Sarah seemed to have a don't touch me force field about her. Yet another reason to pity my charge. A werewolf uncomfortable with touch would be pulled in two opposite directions at all times, and even though there was no excuse for outsourcing that discomfort to others, I finally forgave the girl for setting my cousin and Blaze at each other's throats. If sex appeal was the only power that this troubled teenager thought she possessed, no wonder she made use of her womanly wiles at every opportunity. But the girl didn't seem interested in letting me any further into her confidence, so I decided not to dig deeper into her psyche just yet. Instead, I thanked my tentmate in the only way I knew how, by shimmying out of my clothes and slipping into Sarah's lone dress. And when that effort was rewarded with a hint of a smile, I even let the mother-to-be play with my hair, which she French braided instead of doctoring with the torture devices and sprays that came out of the huge duffel bag for use on her own mane. And for that small mercy I was eternally grateful. 20 minutes passed while Sarah prodded and hummed, treating me like a doll to be dressed and made up. But despite her apparent enjoyment of turning me into a passable imitation of a pack princess, my guest didn't speak again until she was nearly finished. Finally, while tying a ribbon around the base of my braid, the girl leaned closer and whispered in my ear, "You look beautiful tonight." I hadn't been able to share confidences with a real girlfriend since I was a teenager, and as I turned to look up into this pack princess's eyes, I allowed myself to hope that Sarah just might fill that void. The smile we exchanged was tentative but heartfelt, and I imagined for a moment that we were enjoying a bright future in which Wolfie and I were reunited while Sarah and her bloodling pup ran wild with the yahoos. All of my current yearning and subterfuge would be rewarded, and Sarah and I would find something more interesting to talk about than skin-deep beauty and hairstyles. So my lips turned upwards at the girl's kindness, but then the happy expression faded from my face as Sarah finished with a timeless piece of advice. So play hard to get. It was a sign of how far I descended into all-pack paranoia that my first thought was for eavesdropping shifters. But I quickly realized that anyone who might have heard the girl's whisper would just assume that Sarah was referring to my supposed pursuit of her ex-mate. I, on the other hand, understood that the girl had caught my angstful stares in the direction of Justin's brother, and that she felt I needed to be a bit wilier if I wanted to catch and hold the interest of such an enticing male. And even though I knew that Sarah was wrong, that Wolfie and I had no need to play games with one another, I still couldn't prevent the girl's well-intentioned words from sinking their claws into my stomach and ripping with all the vim and vigor of Sarah's own internal bloodling. After all, Wolfie had avoided me all day, seemingly no more interested in my presence than he was in that of the other pack leaders scattered across the field. Had absence made Wolfie's heart grow fonder? Or was this a case of out of sight, out of mind? The presence of a dozen beautifully made-up pack princesses at the ball that evening certainly didn't help ease my internal struggle, nor did Wolfie's apparent intention to dance with each girl in quick succession. As a result, I could barely keep my attention on the alphas I was supposed to be dancing with, instead twisting my head constantly in an effort to trace my mate's path across the dance floor. But which of you is really the pack leader? My current partner, the gray alpha, asked. You or your father? I was saved from answering this tricky question by the flow of the dance, too. Long lines of shifters reforming as we came out of our hands across and then immediately transitioning into a series of reels. You would have thought that Scottish country dancing would be too straight-laced for wild werewolves, but the truth was that we all looked forward to the princess ball on the second night of all pack. And as my current partner and I split apart and then drifted close together again at intervals, I could see why the event was so well attended. Not only did dancing make it easier to avoid unwanted conversations, the ball also gave us girls the chance to peruse long male legs, partially clad in the miniskirts that men insisted in calling kilts. Yum, Finn whispered as I curved around her stationary form. Then she winked as my eye unconsciously drifted down the field toward Wolfie, who was now paired up with Sarah at the other end of the dance floor. Despite my best intentions to play it cool, my nostrils flared as Justin's ex-mate slipped her hand over top of the bloodlings, her lips moving near soundlessly in a jest that caused her dance partner to chuckle. That girl needs to keep her hands off our mate, I thought, the words more appropriate to my irrational wolf side but coming instead from my human mind. Then I realized that I was supposed to be repeating the same maneuver with the gray alpha, and I snapped out of my reverie in time for the pack leader in question to lead me at a gallop down between the two lines of dancers. But as we pivoted to return to our spot, I caught the tinkle of Sarah's laugh behind my back and my jaw clenched again. I was unwilling to imagine the heady rush of joy that the young woman must feel at being swung about in my lover's arms, but I was also incapable of ignoring her pleasure. This is a game, remember, my wolf chided, and not for the first time either. But my human side couldn't think of anything entertaining about letting such an enticing pack princess hang upon my lover's arm, not if I was forced to make nice with this ally of Wolfie's brother in exchange. I would have given just about anything to slip out of my current partner's hold so I could down the set and pull Wolfie out of the pack princess's arm. I would have given anything, except what I'd actually lose if I let my jealous streak take control of my rational mind. Unfortunately, my place at the head of my father's pack wasn't worth surrendering for the sake of a bout of irrational envy, no matter how hard it might be to keep my mind off Wolfie's hands sliding over the skin of another woman. You didn't answer my question, the gray alpha continued, jolting me back to my current predicament once again. His words whispered oh so softly into my ear, but I was aware that they were almost certainly filtering into the lupin senses of the nearby shifters as well. I shot my partner a smile for the sake of our audience, knowing what was coming since I'd already been propositioned twice in the last hour by werewolves from similarly minor clans. But it would have been nice to at least catch this alpha's name before he asked me to be his mate. You're right, my lupin half agreed. I'm sick of games too. Let's go join Wolfie. And although she probably hadn't meant them to, my wolf's words brought me back down to planet Earth at last. With the reality of our situation firmly in mind, I actually managed to increase the wattage of the smile I trained on the alpha in front of me, pretending in the process that I hadn't already formed an unbreakable bond with another mate, because if I were available, then this gray alpha wouldn't have made such a terrible spouse. The shifter in question was older than me by perhaps a decade, and his alliance with Justin suggested that the Greys were old-fashioned and unwilling to dismiss the traditional ways. But despite all of those negatives, this alpha seemed nice enough. His large hand beneath mine was enticingly firm and strong, and none of the alpha's actions toward his underlings displayed anything but good humor. So I encouraged my dance partner in the way I hoped a pack princess would if she were actually seeking a mate and wanted to give a particular suitor a green light. What question did you really want to ask? I responded coyly, but I was careful to time my sally so that we dissolved back into the flow of the dance before the gray alpha could reply, saving me from having to make promises I didn't intend to keep. And then the motion of the dance drew Justin over to stand facing me, his steely gaze cutting into my own. I wasn't surprised to find that Wolfie's brother was less than pleased to find me flirting with another alpha, since I'd all but proposed to this elder young a couple of weeks before. But the anger in Justin's face seemed to go beyond annoyance at my feigned fickleness, and I shivered without meaning to. "Buck up," my wolf warned succinctly, and I straightened my spine before taking Justin's hand to swap places across the dance floor. "Playing games?" Justin asked, the two words all we had time for before I was once again reaching out to a different shifter as each dancer continued to daisy-chain his or her way around the set. But even though Justin's eyes were quickly turned in another direction and his speech had long since dissipated out of our shared airspace, the alpha's two words continued reverberating through my mind. Playing games. Surely Justin simply assumed that I was acting like a flirtatious pack princess who hadn't yet chosen a mate, I thought, attempting to soothe my own nerves. At worst, the alpha might guess that I, like Sarah, was leading along two different bows in an effort to solidify my own position. Either way, Justin should continue to treat me with kid gloves until he was positive that I was going to lend wilder support to another clan. Or so I hoped. But I could still feel the pack leader's cold eyes boring into the base of my skull, and shivers didn't stop running down my spine for the rest of the dance. Chapter 15. "Everything okay?" Fan asked quietly as the jig ended. In all fairness, I should have been the one asking her that question, since the young woman beside me had kept up with the other dancers step for step despite still favoring her broken arm. But before I could reply, I heard the unmistakable sound of Justin's ex-mate in distress, and my attention immediately shifted to a much more pressing problem. "Oh!" Sarah exclaimed, the word much softer than its impact on my adrenaline levels would have suggested. My wolf immediately pricked up her ears, always attuned to the nuances of our pack's voices, but I could see that unrelated dancers were also flaring their nostrils and waking up their wolves to take in the surprising aroma wafting in our direction. The scent resembled the forest floor after a hard rain, sodden pine needles and leaf mold. Not at all the aroma that you'd expect to catch at the princess ball. "Not right here, not right now," I begged silently, but I, and every shifter around me, knew that the girl's cry wasn't due to the innocuous surprise of a stepped-upon dress or a stubbed toe. Nope, that scent alone told us everything we needed to know. So, without another thought for the chaos that I'd leave behind in my wake, I abandoned the dance set forming around me, spun on my heel, and made a beeline for the distressed girl. By the time Sarah came into view, a thread of liquid was already trickling down to stain the front of her skirt, and I wasted half a second to close my eyes and pull myself back together. This was the worst possible moment for the pack princess to go into labor, smack dab in the middle of all pack, with her own ex-mate nearby and with every other alpha jockeying for power. Why had I even allowed the girl to attend, let alone failed to put my foot down when she decided to take part in the dancing? Hadn't I realized that something like this was bound to happen? "You let her come because Sarah gets what Sarah wants," my wolf replied dryly, and I could tell that my lupin half was even less enamored of this troubled and troublesome girl than I was. But, despite our own feelings and the potential loss of stature if we fled the campground en masse during all pack, I knew that the only option now was to rush Sarah to my brother-in-law's side as quickly as possible, because a medical doctor was likely to have tools at his disposal that shifter midwives lacked, and I wasn't about to let our guest perish just because her pregnancy was inconvenient to the rest of us. So I opened my eyes and sought out each member of my pack in quick succession. "David and Blaze, bring around Wolfies and my vehicles. Hawk and Finn, take down our tents and head back to Haven as quickly as possible." Wait. Didn't even need to finish that last thought because the oldest Yahoo was already standing by the pack princess's side, holding one of her arms as he and Wolfie walked our guest away from the dancing ground and toward the road leading to the outside world. I turned to follow, but paused as I felt more than saw Wolfie's brother coming up behind me, his tall form making my own appear minuscule. Like the sudden absence of birdsong when a hunter is sighted creeping through the forest, the dull roar of shifter chatter all around me eased as the dancers strained to catch every word of the upcoming exchange. Not that there was much left for either of us to say, not anymore. "So," the all-pack host began, and it was clear from his tone that my precipitate action and Wolfie's haste to throw his weight behind my pack's efforts had eliminated all possibility of future subterfuge. The jig, was up, and I would now be forced to return to soliciting allies the old-fashioned way, through physical intimidation and mental manipulation, just as my father had done before me. And even though I'd clearly failed in the task that the chief had set for me, I couldn't help feeling relieved that the game my cunning father had initiated was going to end at last. Yes, Justin's pack would likely be at the Wilders' throats in short order, but at least my true mate would be standing by my side. During the battle that was to come, I would be able to drop the pack princess guys that had fit so badly, and together Wolfie and I would handle whatever malice Justin threw our way. But as I peered up into a face that could have been a reflection of my mate's, I couldn't help wondering if Justin really was as devilish as I'd made him out to be. Wolfie's experiences with his sibling dated from over a decade before, when both shifters were mere teenagers, so surely the elder brother would have changed in the interim just as Wolfie had grown and matured. Couldn't help musing that, if the shoe had been on the other foot, Wolfie would have found my charade hilarious, and he definitely would have stepped up to the plate and taken responsibility for his unborn child, and for his endangered ex-mate. With the same young blood running through both brothers' veins, was it really possible for Justin to act so differently? I allowed myself to imagine the pack leader in front of me letting slip his scary alpha demeanor and expressing concern for his ex-mate and unborn child, asking for permission to join us in our mad dash to Dale's house, and then holding Sarah's hand as she gave birth. Fat chance of that, my wolf said silently, and as I peered into the eyes that looked so much like my mate's, but 20 times colder, I was forced to agree. Justin wasn't hoping that I'd fill him in on the state of Sarah's health. Instead, this particular pack leader was angry that he'd lost face courting an unavailable pack princess, and he was annoyed that both my and Wolfie's packs were falling all over ourselves to protect his ex-mate. Finally, as the all-pack host clenched his jaw and fists, it became blindingly clear that the best I could hope for was to be allowed to leave young property alive. Everything else was a pipe dream. So, dropping all pretense, I didn't offer Justin another word. Instead, I just turned on my heel and ran as fast as I could after my true mate. About damn time, my wolf replied, and I had to agree. Play acting had done none of us any good, so it was time to stand up for what we believed in. And if we had to, it was also time to fight for everything we held dear. This time around, there was no argument over who got to ride with whom, not with Wolfie back at the helm. Instead, Wade was tearing out of the Young's driveway with his pack leader in the passenger seat, and with myself and Sarah, a jumble of legs in the back, before Blaze and David had time to consider protesting. I even thought I caught a glimpse of the two former antagonists leaping into the same vehicle in their haste to follow. Or that might be what I'd seen out of the corner of one eye before a strong male hand grabbed the nape of my neck and turned my head around to face forward once again. Without a word, lips that could only be my mate's pressed into mine so hungrily that I completely forgot about the fact that Sarah was about to give birth to a bloodling beside me. I completely forgot that I'd ever doubted Wolfie's interest or watched with envy as he danced in another woman's arms. All I knew was that I was finally right where I belonged, tasting my mate's wolf as his strong hands pulled me forward until the headrest jabbed into my cheek and my neck caught against the seat in front of me. And then, with a sudden bounce of the car, our lip lock fell apart. Sorry about that, Wade said, shooting his pack leader one of those guy expressions that meant you lucky dog or something similar that I was glad not to be privy to. But despite the subtext, it was a relief to catch an actual smile on the oldest Yahoo's face. Wade had taken his responsibilities toward me very seriously over the last few weeks, and the young shifter had seemed to grow grimmer and grimmer with each passing day ever since he'd left his true alpha's side. Now that Wolfie was back in charge, I could almost feel the tension easing out of the younger shifter's form, and my own muscles began to relax in sympathy. But our relief turned out to be short-lived, because the very pregnant teenager beside me immediately started gasping in pain and terror. All eyes turned to our distressed pack princess, and only Wolfie's hand on his underling's arm kept Wade from swerving off the road. What our driver couldn't discern, but what Wolfie's and my more dominant wolves could easily see, was that the tiny bloodling within Sarah's womb was moving frantically now, the pup's small butt, sharp teeth and claws scrabbled at the girl's insides. Wincing in sympathy, I took Sarah's hand in mine, silently bemoaning my total lack of midwife skills. Even as I realized that my gesture was worse than useless. Luckily, Wolfie had even that problem under control. Shift, he commanded. The word brooking no opposition, and Wade and I both had to concentrate fully, in order to resist the seductive lure that spilled over into our own air. Space. This time the car did swerve for a second before Wade was once again able to take control of the wheel, but I barely noticed our almost accident. Instead, my eyes were trained on the passenger beside me, a spot that used to be filled by Sarah's girlish form but that was now taken up by a slender white wolf whose belly seemed much less distended than it had been in human form. You could have at least given the poor thing time to take off her clothes, I chastened as I attempted to pry a dress and underwear off an improperly shaped Lupin. I didn't put any heat into my words though because Sarah did seem more comfortable four-legged, and Wolfie just grinned at my half-hearted rebuke, his own canine partner fully present behind the bloodling's eyes. I'd forgotten how the constant proximity of my mate's wolf made the trials and tribulations of daily life seem that much simpler, his linear Lupin mind smoothing out the nervous wiggles of my own human brain waves. I'd forgotten. But now that the calming influence was back, I basked in it. Until, that is, my mate pressed a scary-looking hypodermic needle into my palm. This needs to go into Sarah's muscle, Wolfie ordered, ignoring the fact that his instructions were nearly as alarming as the idea of helping a pregnant wolf give birth in the back seat of a speeding car. Jab it all the way into her thigh as if you wanted to come out the other side, he continued. Levelly. What's in the needle? I asked, nearly dropping the hypodermic in Sarah's nose turned in my direction at last. Her child must have been lulled by the mother's change of form enough to pause its biting and clawing because the pack princess's eyes were softer now and less filled with pain. In fact, if I could read wolf expressions, and I usually could, I thought Sarah might be telling me to stop asking questions and to start following orders. She at least seemed to trust my mate implicitly. So, without waiting for Wolfie's reply, I gathered up my courage and did as he ordered. I'd never used a hypodermic before, and I was surprised by how the needle caught on Sarah's tough hide, not wanting to go all the way in, but I just gritted my teeth and pushed harder, until the pointed tip sank in deep. Sarah whimpered slightly, but it was my hand that shook from our sudden shared pain, a sure sign that I'd admitted this girl into my pack despite all reservations to the contrary. Now pull back on the plunger just a little to make sure you haven't hit a vein, Wolfie said calmly, and I struggled to obey without removing the needle from Sarah's thigh. She lay silent and uncomplaining now, even though I could feel the way the sliver of metal ached within her muscle, and I had to admit that Sarah was made of sterner stuff than her pack princess exterior had initially suggested. Good, Wolfie continued, praising us both equally. Now inject every bit of it right there. As I followed my mate's instructions and then eased the needle out of the wolf's thigh, the pack leader's attention turned from me to Sarah at last. The bloodling alpha placed one gentle hand on our guest's Lupin nose, a gesture that might have been meant to further soothe the beast, or to prevent her from jerking around and biting my hand. I didn't inquire further, content in the knowledge that my mate understood that I and Sarah appreciated either alternative. That's a tranquilizer, Wolfie explained to all and sundry as I slipped the plastic cap back onto the needle. Dr. Baker prescribed it to keep you and your baby calm until we get to the clinic, he added, directing his words to the patient now. Not that there's any reason to worry. I'm sure you couldn't tell, but I'm a bloodling, he added over the sound of Wade's sudden burst of laughter. And I came out okay. Your baby will too. I hoped that Sarah didn't notice Wolfie's omission, that my mate had made no mention of his own mother. And for good reason, since the woman had died as soon as her youngest son entered the world. But between the pangs of pregnancy and the effects of the drug, Sarah probably wasn't thinking too clearly at the moment, and she made no response to Wolfie's reassurance. Instead, the pregnant wolf simply let her chin drop down onto my knee, her eyes sliding shut as the mother-to-be drifted into one last pocket of rest. Before her real ordeal began. I'll just give Dale a call to let him know we're coming, Wolfie finished quietly, meeting my gaze briefly before pulling out a cell phone and punching in my brother-in-law's number. I'd almost forgotten that such time savers existed, and the warm car suddenly seemed to cocoon me in an entirely different world than the one I'd inhabited for the last few weeks. Technological aids, my mate's reassuring voice filling the air, even Sarah's quiet breathing by my side, all acted to calm my racing pulse and to fill me with peace. I just hoped that Wolfie and I had been able to impart some small measure of that same peace to the teenage werewolf lying beside me, whose feet looked too large for her legs and whose ears twitched as she dreamed. Without her vivacious personality to color my vision, I couldn't help thinking that Sarah was far too young to be facing such life and death challenges, too young to give birth and too young to be a mother. As a way of making myself feel better more than anything else, I slid a hand across the youngster's fur. Then I tugged down on the skirt of my dress so the cloth touched Sarah's nose. Perhaps the wolf would be able to feel her parents' love soaking out of the fabric and into her own skin. Or if not her parents, hopefully she could feel my own. Chapter 16. It's a good thing the clinic is closed for the evening, Dale greeted us as two tall shifters in kilts carried Sarah's lupin form into the doctor's office. I could see my brother-in-law's point. We definitely weren't the type of patients who usually came to call at this rural clinic, so Sarah had chosen a fortuitous time to go into labor. However, even though the support staff had all left for the day, a quick look around the entranceway proved that the doctor wasn't entirely alone. "Hi, Aunt Tara," his son Keith offered, waving a cheerful greeting in my direction before returning his attention to the more interesting shifter who was helping Wolfie carry Sarah into the room. Wade greeted the 14-year-old with a quick high five, tossing the pack princess's comatose body up into the air to free one hand for the salute, and I would have protested if I hadn't known that my mate could easily have caught the sleeping werewolf had the Yahoo fumbled re-entry. But to Keith's delight, Wade did recapture the pack princess's descending hindquarters easily, and the Yahoo finished by gracing the kid with a wink before following Wolfie down the hall and into the room that Dale had prepared. With Sarah safely on a solid surface, I returned my attention to my nephew, whose presence wasn't really appropriate for the life or death battle soon to come. At 14, Keith was balancing on the cusp of manhood, and I could understand why his father thought this experience might be a formative one. And yet, do you really think Keith's ready to assist at a birth? I asked my brother-in-law. As if to prove my point, the kid's usually animated face closed down, and he hastily pulled out a mobile gaming device to bury his nose into. Even though my nephew had been thrilled at the thought of watching a bunch of female werewolves stripped down in order to shift forms a few months earlier, he was definitely much less interested in seeing Sarah's girl parts in this setting at least. So why was the kid here? An explanation was soon forthcoming, but the words didn't emerge from my brother-in-law's lips. "Keith is pack," Wolfie offered tersely as he walked back down the hall toward us. I could see my mate's muscles tensing as a rarely used alpha tone entered his voice, and I could also feel his wolf rising even closer to the surface than usual as the bloodling alpha's protective instincts were aroused. Still, my mate's hands had been gentle as he laid Sarah down on the examining table, and he sent a reassuring smile in my nephew's direction as well when the kid raised his eyes to seek out those of the alpha. Unlike other pack leaders, Wolfie reserved his harshness solely for opponents who threatened his pack. Opponents like his brother. "Justin will be out hunting tonight," Wolfie elaborated, rejoining us in the hallway and reminding us that Sarah's life wasn't the only one at stake this evening. I was suddenly glad that my mate had thought ahead to ensure Keith would be safe under our protective eye, and I allowed my hand to slide into Wolfie's in mute apology for doubting his choices. "We can't let any pack member wander off alone this evening," my mate continued, squeezing my hand gently in his massive paw. "So I sent the rest of our clan to join yours at Haven, but it seemed like a better idea to keep Keith here with his father." Wolfie was right, but his words still made me shiver as I remembered the way my own father had kidnapped his grandson just a few months earlier. Although no one had ever taken me to task for my part in the train wreck that led up to that abduction, I was well aware that my choices had been the cause of Keith being stuck in a strange shifter village for days on end, bullied both physically and mentally in the process. I'd been the one who insinuated myself into Dale's and Keith's lives, trying to foist off my responsibilities as wilder pack leader onto my teenage nephew, and I'd also been the one who had given Keith permission to head back to his empty house with only the Yahoos for protection on that fateful afternoon. Of course Chief Wilder bore the ultimate responsibility for ordering his underlings to snatch the kid out of his human home, but I knew deep down inside that the real burden of blame was mine. As a result, I still woke up in terror some nights, thinking that Keith had once again been swiped from beneath my nose and was being tossed around by my father's crazy schemes. But looking at the kid now, I saw that my nephew had bounced back just fine from his trauma, and the body language in the room suggested that he and my brother-in-law were getting along better as a family unit now than they had before I'd come into either of their lives. So maybe my fumbling gestures hadn't been entirely wrong-headed after all. Perhaps it was time to simply learn from my mistakes and move on. As I slowly forgave myself for past failures, Wolfie caught my eye and nodded his agreement, his expression much softer than it had been a moment earlier. The bloodling alpha often seemed to know what I was thinking before I spoke, and I hoped that his nod was an absolution of my culpability, because if this accomplished pack leader felt that it was time for me to let my past mistakes go, then who was I, whose experience as alpha wasn't yet a season old, to say that he was wrong? But before my mate could confirm or deny my guess, Blaze and David came pushing through the door in tandem, their young male energy suddenly making the room appear much smaller and more crowded than it had a moment before. "We're here," the Yahoo announced, both himself and his companion, just in case any of us had missed the doors banging loudly against the walls during the haste of their entry. Then Blaze's eyes lit upon the pack princess lying prone on the table in wolf form, and he paled, taking a step forward. "Is she?" the Yahoo blurted out. "Just tranquilized," Wolfie explained, a hint of a smile turning up the corners of his lips. Although my mate couldn't be privy to the full extent of the two young shifters' competition for the affections of our troublesome pack princess, the bloodling alpha must have seen enough during our stay at all pack to have clued in to the Yahoo's crush, and as usual my mate was amused rather than annoyed by something that I had considered to be a major headache. I couldn't quite make myself share Wolfie's amusement, but I was glad to see that David and Blaze had arrived in one piece, and without coming to blows in the process. On the other hand, I could also tell that their jostling wasn't entirely good-natured as the two stepped closer to Sarah's supine form, so I followed in their footsteps, ready to intervene if necessary. But before Wolfie or I could squash the youth's rivalry, another chilling dose of authority blew through the room, this time from an unexpected source. "We need to decide who's going to be in the delivery room with the mother," my human brother-in-law said loudly, his shoulders seeming to gain width as he stepped forward and took command of our unruly crew. "I'd rather have just two assistants stay here with me, so who would like to be included?" "Tara will join you," Wolfie said immediately, meeting my gaze, and I nodded my approval. Yes, I was scared to death of being shut up in a room with a dying werewolf and her bloodling child, but I'd rather be the one clutching Sarah's hand to ease her into the next world if the worst-case scenario came about. And maybe it wouldn't come to that. Maybe the tentative bond that Sarah and I had built between us would even lend the teenager some much-needed strength as she struggled to give birth to a bloodling child. For a similar reason, I expected the girls' beaux to fight over the right to join me in the delivery room, but on this issue the two young males seemed to be united. "How about Blaze and I trade off standing guard outside and keeping an eye on the kid?" David asked, his question aimed at me rather than at the stronger alpha, and I realized with a jolt that I was still the leader of at least one shifter in this room. I'd willingly ceded the Yahoos back to their former alpha as soon as Wolfie had taken control of our flight from Allpack. But that didn't make me any less the leader of the Wilder clan. Nevertheless, I glanced at Wolfie for his approval of David's suggestion. After all, we were all within the bloodling alpha's territory now, and I was used to accepting my mate's wisdom. But Wolfie remained silent, apparently not willing to intervene between me and my new pack, so I was left in charge of answering my cousin's question. "That's a good idea," I agreed after a short pause, and the wave of young males immediately crashed out of the room in a clatter of shod feet and banging doors, even more loudly than they'd come in. It appeared that Sarah's beaux and my nephew were all scaredy-cats when it came to childbirth. Not that I could blame them. With the youngest shifters taken care of, Wade glanced back and forth between me and Wolfie, seeking permission to either go or stay. I jutted my chin at my mate, throwing the ball back into his court, and the bloodling alpha immediately locked eyes with his underling and friend, the two shifters. Wolves seemed to be speaking paragraphs without words, if the intensity of the ensuing silence was any indication, and I realized that the bond between these two pack mates was stronger than I'd at first supposed. Someday when all of the current drama was over, I needed to sit down with my mate and learn the story behind each member of his band of misfits, and perhaps find out a bit more about my mysterious mate in the process. But for now Wade and Wolfie seemed to have come to a conclusion without the need for speech, and the Yahoo just nodded once before striding over to stand guard just inside the door. Appeared that Wade would be my partner in delivery while Wolfie would join the younger shifters in patrolling the grounds, a division of labor that would keep us all safer. But that left me feeling bereft even before my mate had left the room. Unfortunately, the decision also left me worried. Wolfie wasn't the kind of alpha who outsourced the worst problems to his underlings, which meant that if the bloodling alpha was heading outdoors, that must be where he expected the greatest danger to lie. And the pack leader was probably right. There was an excellent possibility that Justin would track our little entourage down before the evening was over, and the elder young was bound to arrive with dozens of trained shifters at his beck and call. Wolfie, on the other hand, would be making his stand alone save for the help of a Yahoo not yet out of his teens and my not much older cousin. No wonder a shiver ran down my spine as I realized that I might never again see my mate alive. "Don't be stupid," my wolf chided me tersely, and at the same time Sarah began to whimper, forcing me to tear my eyes away from Wolfie's gaze rather than pulling him into my arms. So I refrained from arguing when my mate brushed his lips quickly across mine and then turned on his heel to protect our pack from all comers. No, I didn't cling to my mate as he strode out of the room, but I so badly wanted to that I had to close my eyes tightly to keep from watching Wolfie leave, because whether my lupin half thought my fears were unfounded or not, I had a bad feeling that more than one shifter would die before this night was over, and I didn't know what I'd do if the lifeless werewolf was my mate. "So how should we do this?" Dale asked, bringing me back to the present with a jolt, and not a pleasant one either. After all, my brother-in-law was the doctor. Shouldn't he know what came next? Well, probably not if Sarah was his first werewolf patient, and chances were very good that our pack princess was. "You mean, should she be in wolf or human form?" Wade asked quietly, answering a question with a question and drifting back into the center of the room now that his pack leader had taken his leave. "Maybe it would be easier if Sarah stayed wolf. Do you think the bloodling would come out more cleanly then?" "No." The whisper of sound came from behind us, and I turned to find our patient awake and two-legged at last, lifting her torso off the table slowly. As she tried to project her feeble voice in our general direction, the girl paused as a tremor racked her form, and I would have thought that the cause was merely a contraction if I hadn't been able to see the bloodling awaken within her womb, awaken, and begin once again to scrabble with its sharp little claws, looking for a way out of the enveloping darkness. "Bev told me that she tried that with one mother," Sarah continued once her child had stilled momentarily, allowing the pack princess to regain her breath. "The bloodling was too big to come out through a wolf's vagina, though, so both died." Wade and I blanched at the stark words, but the mother-to-be seemed to have accepted her fate, even if her voice was still weak and broken, and Sarah wasn't the only one who seemed willing to step up to the plate and attempt to vanquish long odds. Dale re-entered full doctor mode, even more in control now that a human being instead of a wolf was sitting on his examining table. "All right," my brother-in-law said calmly. "In that case, it sounds like a C-section is our best option. Usually I do this at the hospital, but I'm guessing that's not a good idea." The doctor's kind eyes twinkled as he spoke, and I was surprised but also reassured to notice Sarah smiling back. Both doctor and patient impressed me. Dale with his easy bedside manner in the face of a medical malady that he surely hadn't known existed until a couple of weeks before, and Sarah with her stoicism in the face of long odds. In fact, it didn't seem like Wade or I was really needed here, so I stepped back and let the doctor and patient converse alone. "Do you want a gown to cover your upper body?" my brother-in-law asked the naked pack princess as he began puttering around his workspace and readying supplies for the procedure. I tried not to look too closely at the scalpel that the human pulled out of one drawer, and even Wade's poker face turned a bit green as the Yahoo took in the sharp blade. But Sarah didn't flinch, nor did she request a gown. It doesn't matter, replied the girl with the supreme unconcern for nudity of a born and bred werewolf. Or perhaps the pack princess was just using every bit of gumption she possessed in order to resist the inner pain that must have been ripping through her body as the bloodling in her womb once again began to move. I could feel a sympathetic ache starting up in my own stomach before I looked away, and I noticed that Wade had angled his body to gaze out the darkened window rather than focusing on the intrepid teenager who had brought us all together tonight. In that case, I'll show you two how to scrub up, Dale said, returning his attention to me and Wade. And then we can get started.